The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Thornwick Castle like tears refusing to fall. Princess Catherine stood at the tall windows of the blue drawing room, watching the first rays of sunlight pierce through the Scottish Highlands that had been her home for the past 15 years. Her fingers traced the condensation on the glass, creating small patterns that would disappear as quickly as they formed, much like the life she was about to leave behind. Behind her, the soft rustle of paper indicated that Prince Alexander was still reading the official documents that had arrived at dawn. The Royal Council's decision had been final, delivered in the cold, formal language that had governed their lives since birth. Due to increasing political tensions and security concerns, the Crown Prince and Princess were to be relocated to the Commonwealth territories overseas, effective immediately. The word exile was never used, but Catherine understood its weight nonetheless. "The children don't know yet," Alexander said quietly, his voice carrying the burden of a man who had never imagined this day would come. At 38, he had spent his entire adult life preparing to serve his country from within its borders. The thought of raising their 3 children in a foreign land, away from their heritage and the people they were meant to serve, felt like a betrayal of everything he had been taught to believe. Catherine turned from the window, her emerald dress rustling softly against the Persian carpet that had been a wedding gift from the Queen Mother. Her auburn hair caught the morning light, and Alexander was reminded of the first time he had seen her at a charity gala in London 12 years ago. She had been laughing at something her friend had whispered, her eyes bright with joy and completely unaware that she would one day become the most beloved member of the royal family. "We have to tell them today," she replied, moving to the mahogany desk where their official correspondence lay scattered like fallen leaves. "Emma asks every morning when we're going to visit grandmother's grave again. She doesn't understand why we can't go to London anymore." Their eldest daughter, Princess Emma, had just turned 11 and possessed an intelligence that sometimes startled even her parents. She had inherited Alexander's analytical mind and Catherine's compassionate heart, making her particularly sensitive to the subtle changes in the palace atmosphere over the past months. The increased security, the hushed conversations that stopped when she entered a room, the way certain trusted staff members had quietly disappeared from their posts, nothing escaped her notice. Prince James, at 8 years old, remained blissfully unaware of the political machinations that threatened to tear their family from everything they held dear. His main concern was whether he would be able to take his collection of model trains to their new home, wherever that might be. The youngest, Princess Sophie, was only 4, still young enough to adapt to change without fully understanding its implications. Alexander joined Catherine at the desk, his hand finding hers among the papers. His wedding ring caught the light, a simple band of Welsh gold that had been crafted from the same nugget used for his mother's ring and grandmother's before her. The continuity it represented seemed almost mocking now, a symbol of traditions they might never be able to pass on to their children in the way they had always planned. "Lord Pemberton has arranged for us to address the nation tomorrow evening," Alexander continued, referring to the Prime Minister's chief advisor who had become their reluctant messenger in recent weeks. "The BBC will broadcast it live from the throne room. After that, we have 72 hours to prepare for departure." Catherine's breath caught slightly. She had known this moment was approaching, but hearing the timeline spoken aloud made it feel suddenly, devastatingly real. 72 hours to say goodbye to a lifetime of service, to the charities she had championed, to the people who had welcomed her into their hearts despite her common birth, to the very identity she had built as a working member of the royal family. "What about the Highland Games next month?" she asked, thinking of the annual event they had attended together for the past decade. "The MacLeod clan has been planning their presentation for months. And the new children's wing at Edinburgh Hospital. We were supposed to open it together." Alexander's jaw tightened as he considered the dozens of commitments they would be forced to abandon. The Scottish Highland Games had become particularly meaningful to them, representing a bridge between the formal duties of royalty and the genuine warmth of the people they served. Catherine had learned to toss the cobber, much to the delight of the local clans, while Alexander had proven surprisingly adept at the hammer throw. Their participation had transformed what could have been mere ceremonial appearances into authentic connections with Scottish culture. "Pemberton says they'll arrange for video messages," Alexander replied, though they both knew it wouldn't be the same. The magic of Catherine's presence, the way she could make a child in a hospital bed feel like the most important person in the world, or how Alexander's genuine interest in local businesses had revitalized entire communities. These couldn't be replicated through a screen. A soft knock interrupted their conversation. Mrs. Macpherson, their head housekeeper for the past 8 years, entered with a tea service, her usually steady hands trembling slightly as she set down the silver tray. The elderly Scottish woman had served 3 generations of the royal family, and Catherine had noticed the tears she tried to hide during their morning briefings over the past week. "Your Royal Highnesses," Mrs. Macpherson said, her Highland accent thicker than usual with emotion. "The children are asking about their morning ride. Should I prepare the horses as usual?" Catherine and Alexander exchanged glances. Their morning rides through the estate had become a cherished family tradition, a time when they could simply be parents and children, racing across the moors without the weight of duty and protocol. Today, it felt especially important to maintain some semblance of normalcy, even as their world crumbled around them. "Yes, please," Catherine said gently. "And Mrs. Macpherson, could you ask cook to prepare something special for lunch? I think we'll eat in the conservatory today." The housekeeper's eyes brightened slightly at this small deviation from routine. The conservatory, with its soaring glass ceiling and exotic plants, had always been Catherine's favorite room in the castle. It was where she had taught Emma to paint watercolors, where James had built his first successful card house, and where Sophie had taken her first steps while chasing butterflies among the orchids. After Mrs. Macpherson left, Catherine moved to the ornate mirror that had once belonged to Queen Victoria. Her reflection showed a woman who had aged gracefully into her role, but she could see the toll recent events had taken. There were new lines around her eyes, a tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there 6 months ago when their biggest worry had been planning Emma's birthday celebration. "Do you remember our first interview after the engagement was announced?" she asked, still looking at her reflection. "That journalist asked if I was prepared for a life of service, and I said yes so confidently. I thought I understood what that meant." Alexander came to stand behind her, his hands resting on her shoulders. In the mirror, they looked like any other couple facing an uncertain future, stripped of the titles and expectations that had defined them for so long. "You've served this country with more dedication than most people born to it," he said firmly. "Don't let anyone make you question that. But have I served it well enough?" Catherine's voice was barely above a whisper. "The polls show that 68% of the population supports our work. The children's charities we've established have helped thousands of families. The mental health initiatives have saved lives. And yet, here we are, being sent away because of political convenience." The political crisis that had led to their exile had been brewing for months. A series of leaked documents had suggested that certain members of the royal family had been involved in questionable financial dealings, though neither Catherine nor Alexander had been directly implicated. However, their popularity with the public had made them inconvenient for a government struggling to maintain control. Rather than risk their presence overshadowing elected officials, the decision had been made to relocate them for their own safety and the stability of the realm. "We're not being sent away because we failed," Alexander said, his reflection meeting hers in the mirror. "We're being sent away because we succeeded too well. Because people trust us more than they trust the politicians who are supposed to represent them." Outside, they could hear the sound of horses being led from the stables, accompanied by the excited voices of their children. James was explaining something to Sophie in the patient tone he had developed as a big brother, while Emma's clear voice carried on the wind as she thanked the stable master for preparing her favorite mare. "They're so resilient," Catherine observed, watching through the window as Emma helped Sophie climb into her saddle. "Sometimes I wonder if children are better at adapting to change than adults are." "They have us to help them through it," Alexander replied. "That's what matters. Wherever we go, whatever we face, they'll have stability in us." Catherine turned in his arms, studying the face she had loved for 12 years. Alexander had been born to duty, raised from childhood to understand that his personal desires would always come second to the needs of the crown. Yet he had chosen love when he chose her, a decision that had required him to fight for permission to marry outside the traditional aristocratic circles. "I need to call my mother," Catherine said suddenly. "She should hear about this from us, not from the evening news." Catherine's mother, Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, had worked as a nurse for 40 years before retiring to a small cottage in the Cotswolds. She had watched her daughter's transformation from a middle-class girl who loved art history into a princess who commanded respect on the world stage. And she had never lost her ability to provide exactly the right words of comfort when they were needed most. "She'll want to come with us?" Alexander said with a slight smile. "You know she will. And I'll want her to," Catherine admitted. "Is that selfish? Asking her to leave her garden and her book club and her entire life because I can't bear the thought of being in a foreign country without her. It's human, Alexander replied. And if anyone understands the sacrifices required by loving someone in this family, it's your mother. The telephone conversation with Mrs. Hartwell was as difficult as Catherine had anticipated. There was a long silence after Catherine explained the situation, broken only by the sound of her mother's measured breathing. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the same calm strength that had guided Catherine through every crisis of her life. Well then, Mrs. Hartwell said simply, I suppose I'll need to arrange for someone to look after the roses. When do we leave? By afternoon, news of their impending departure had begun to leak to the press, despite the government's attempts to control the narrative. Catherine's private secretary fielded dozens of calls from journalists, charity organizations, and members of the public who had somehow obtained their direct number. The official announcement wouldn't come until the following evening. But, in the age of social media and 24-hour news cycles, secrets rarely remained hidden for long. Catherine spent the afternoon in her office, writing personal letters to the patrons and staff of the various organizations she had supported over the years. Each letter was carefully crafted to express her gratitude while avoiding any language that might be interpreted as criticism of the government's decision. Even in exile, she remained mindful of her duty to maintain the dignity of the crown. To Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the director of the Children's Hospital in Edinburgh, she wrote, While circumstances require that I step back from my official role, please know that the work you do remains close to my heart. The children you care for have taught me more about courage and resilience than any royal training ever could. To James Robertson, the young veteran who had become a spokesman for military mental health after they had met at a charity event 3 years earlier, she wrote, Your bravery in sharing your story has changed countless lives. I have no doubt that you will continue to be a voice of hope for those who need it most. Each letter felt like a small goodbye, a severing of connections that had given her life meaning and purpose. Catherine had never sought the spotlight for its own sake, but she had learned to use her platform to amplify causes that might otherwise have been forgotten. The thought of losing that ability felt like losing a part of herself. Alexander spent his afternoon in a series of video conferences with government officials, working through the practical details of their departure. Questions of security, housing arrangements, and the transfer of their official duties dominated the conversations, though the underlying tension was palpable. Everyone involved understood that this was an unprecedented situation, one that would likely have lasting implications for the monarchy itself. The house in Vancouver is being prepared as we speak, Lord Pemberton explained during their final call of the day. It's a private residence, well secured, but not ostentatious. The Canadian government has been very cooperative in ensuring your family's safety and privacy. And our staff? Alexander asked, thinking of the dozens of people who had dedicated their careers to supporting the royal household. Essential personnel only, Pemberton replied curtly. Mrs. McPherson has requested to accompany you, and we've approved that. Detective Inspector Wells will handle security coordination. Beyond that, you'll need to establish new arrangements locally. The casual dismissal of people who had become like family stung more than Alexander had expected. Thomas, the head gardener who had taught Emma to identify Scottish wildflowers. Margaret, the governess who had been patient with James during his difficult period after starting school. Even young Peter, the newest footman who dreamed of one day working at Buckingham Palace. All of them would be left behind, their loyalty unrewarded by the cold calculations of political expediency. That evening, as they gathered for what would be their last family dinner at Thornwick Castle, Catherine made a decision that would define how she remembered this place. Instead of focusing on what they were losing, she would help her children create one final, beautiful memory. Tonight, she announced as they sat around the polished oak table in the family dining room. We're going to tell the story of every room in this castle. Everyone gets to share their favorite memory from each place. Emma, ever the thoughtful eldest child, began with the library, describing how Alexander had read her adventure stories every night when she was 6, doing different voices for all the characters. James chose the music room, where Catherine had patiently taught him to play piano, never losing her temper even when he consistently forgot to curve his fingers properly. Sophie, with the matter-of-fact wisdom of a 4-year-old, declared that her favorite memory was all the times Mama sang me to sleep when the thunder was scary. As they moved through each room in their minds, Catherine felt something shift inside her. Yes, they were leaving behind a place filled with history and meaning. But they were taking something more valuable with them, the love and memories that had been created within these walls, the bonds that no political decision could ever sever. Tomorrow, she told her children as she tucked them into bed for the last time in their familiar rooms, we'll start writing new stories together. Different stories, but just as wonderful. Emma looked up at her with eyes that seemed far too mature for 11 years old. Will we ever come home again, Mama? Catherine smoothed her daughter's hair, choosing her words carefully. Home isn't just a place, darling. Home is where your family is, where you're loved and safe. And that will never change, no matter where we go. As Catherine and Alexander finally retired to their own bedroom, the weight of the day settled over them like a heavy blanket. Tomorrow would bring the public announcement, the formal farewell to their life of service. But tonight, in the quiet of their room overlooking the Scottish Highlands, they allowed themselves to grieve for the future they had planned and would never see. Whatever happens next, Alexander said as he held her close, we'll face it together. Catherine closed her eyes and listened to the familiar sounds of the castle settling into night, the ancient timbers creaking, the wind whistling through the corridors, the distant sound of the burn flowing over the rocks. Tomorrow, these sounds would become memories. But tonight, they were still home. The morning of their final public appearance dawned gray and drizzly, as if the Scottish sky itself was mourning their departure. Catherine stood in front of her wardrobe, contemplating what one wore to say goodbye to a nation. The navy blue dress with the subtle tartan trim caught her eye. It had been a gift from a local designer during their first Highland Games, crafted specifically to honor both her role and her adopted homeland. The irony wasn't lost on her that she would be wearing Scottish colors to announce their exile from Scotland. Alexander was already dressed in his formal uniform, the one reserved for state occasions. The royal Stuart tartan of his sash seemed to mock them both, a reminder of traditions and loyalties that political necessity was forcing them to abandon. His face wore the controlled expression he had perfected over years of public service, but Catherine could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. The children, she asked, fastening the pearl earrings that had been her wedding gift from the Queen Mother. Mrs. Macpherson is keeping them occupied in the nursery, Alexander replied. I thought it would be better if they didn't see us leave for the recording. We can tell them about it properly when we return. The drive to Edinburgh seemed shorter than usual, though Detective Inspector Wells took his customary security route through the back roads. Catherine watched the familiar landscape roll past, the ancient stone walls that divided the fields, the sheep dotting the hillsides like scattered clouds, the villages where she had opened fetes and visited schools, and listened to the concerns of ordinary people who had somehow decided that a princess could understand their struggles. The BBC Scotland building buzzed with nervous energy as their motorcade arrived. Catherine had done dozens of interviews and recorded messages over the years, but this felt fundamentally different. This wasn't about promoting a charity or celebrating an achievement. This was about explaining why they were abandoning the people who had trusted them. Director Sarah Maxwell met them in the lobby, her usual professional demeanor slightly strained. Catherine had worked with her on several documentary projects, including an acclaimed series about Scottish heritage that had won international recognition. Sarah had become more than a colleague over the years, developing into something resembling a friend, which made this encounter particularly painful. Your Royal Highnesses, Sarah said, her voice carefully neutral. We're set up in Studio A. The lighting tests have been completed, and we're ready whenever you are. The studio had been arranged to strike a balance between formality and warmth. 2 chairs were positioned in front of a backdrop featuring the royal coat of arms, but the lighting was soft enough to avoid the harshness that might make them appear distant or cold. A small side table held glasses of water and a single white rose, Catherine's signature flower. We'll have approximately 15 minutes, Alexander said as they took their seats. The Prime Minister's office insisted on reviewing the final edit before broadcast, but they've agreed not to make content changes. Catherine nodded, though the knowledge that their words would be scrutinized and potentially censored added another layer of complexity to an already impossible task. How did one explain political exile in terms that wouldn't inflame public opinion or embarrass the government? How did one express genuine regret without appearing to criticize the decision-makers? Rolling in 5, called the camera operator, a young man Catherine recognized from previous recordings. His usual cheerful demeanor was subdued today, replaced by the kind of professional focus that emerged during particularly significant moments. Sarah Maxwell positioned herself behind the cameras, ready to provide guidance if needed. Remember, we can do multiple takes if necessary, she said gently. There's no pressure to get everything perfect on the first try. But Catherine knew they wouldn't need multiple takes. After 12 years of public speaking, she had learned to find her center even in the most challenging circumstances. Beside her, Alexander sat with the quiet dignity that had made him one of the most respected members of the royal family, despite never being heir to the throne. Rolling, the camera operator announced. Alexander spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of royal tradition. Good evening. Princess Catherine and I are speaking to you tonight to share some important news about our family's future. As you may have heard, circumstances have arisen that require us to step back from our official duties and relocate outside of Scotland. Catherine took up the narrative smoothly, her voice warm despite the gravity of their message. Over the past 12 years, you have welcomed me into your communities and your hearts with a generosity that has humbled me every day. From the fishing villages of the Highlands to the bustling streets of Glasgow, you have taught me what it means to serve with purpose and passion. She paused, allowing herself a moment to think of specific faces. Mrs. Henderson, who had invited her for tea in her tiny flat in Aberdeen and shared stories of raising 5 children on her own. Young Tommy MacLeod, who had overcome cerebral palsy to become a champion swimmer with Catherine's encouragement. The women at the domestic violence shelter in Stirling who had trusted her with their stories and their hopes. We want you to know that this decision, while necessary, does not reflect any change in our commitment to the causes and communities we have been privileged to serve. The work will continue, even if we cannot be here to participate directly. Alexander leaned forward slightly, his expression earnest. We also want to address the speculation and rumors that have surrounded our family in recent months. Princess Catherine and I have always conducted ourselves with integrity and transparency. We have nothing to hide, and we leave Scotland with our heads held high and our consciences clear. The statement was as close to criticism of the government's decision as they dared to venture. Both of them understood the delicate balance required. They needed to maintain their dignity without appearing to challenge the authority that had effectively exiled them. Catherine's voice softened as she addressed the most personal aspect of their departure. Our children, Princess Emma, Prince James, and Princess Sophie, were born on Scottish soil and have known no other home. They have played in the gardens of Thornwick Castle, learned Scottish history from their tutors, and participated in Highland traditions with the joy of children who belong somewhere completely. We will ensure that they carry these connections with them always, no matter where our future takes us. The friendships we have made, the memories we have created, the bonds we have formed with the people of Scotland, these are not things that distance can diminish, Alexander added. Geography may separate us, but the relationships we have built are permanent. Sarah Maxwell made a subtle hand gesture, indicating they had about 5 minutes remaining. Catherine felt the weight of everything unsaid, the frustration, the sense of injustice, the fear about their uncertain future. But she also felt something else, a deep gratitude for the opportunity to have served, even if that service was being cut short. We want to thank the staff who have supported our work with such dedication, Catherine continued. From our household team at Thornwick Castle to the volunteers who have given their time to our various patronages, you have made everything we accomplished possible. Your loyalty and friendship have meant more to us than you can know. Alexander's voice grew slightly thicker with emotion as he addressed their final point. To the young people of Scotland who have participated in our youth programs, who have shared their dreams and aspirations with us, you are the future of this nation. Your creativity, your determination, your compassion give us hope for a world that sometimes seems too full of division and conflict. Continue to believe in yourselves and in your ability to make a difference. Catherine concluded their statement with words she had rehearsed dozens of times, but which still felt inadequate to express the magnitude of their loss. We leave Scotland, but Scotland will never leave us. The lessons you have taught us about community, resilience, and genuine kindness will guide us wherever we go. We carry your trust with us as our most precious possession, and we promise to honor it always. Thank you for 12 years of service, friendship, and love, Alexander said simply. We will miss you more than words can express. Cut, called the camera operator, and the formal part of their goodbye was complete. Sarah Maxwell approached them as the crew began to pack up their equipment. That was beautifully done, she said, though her professional assessment couldn't hide her personal sadness. It struck exactly the right tone, dignified but heartfelt. Will it matter? Catherine asked, more to herself than to Sarah. Will people understand why this is happening, or will they think we're abandoning them? The people who know you, really know you, will understand, Sarah replied. And that's most of Scotland, Your Royal Highness. You've touched too many lives for people to doubt your sincerity now. The drive back to Thornwick Castle was conducted mostly in silence. Both Catherine and Alexander were lost in their own thoughts, processing what they had just done and what it meant for their future. The recording would be broadcast that evening during prime time, followed by expert analysis and public reaction that they would watch from thousands of miles away. Do you think we said enough? Alexander finally asked as they turned into the familiar tree-lined drive of their estate. I think we said everything we were allowed to say, Catherine replied carefully. The rest will have to speak for itself. Mrs. Macpherson met them at the entrance, her expression carefully controlled, but her red-rimmed eyes betraying her emotional state. The children have been asking questions, she reported quietly. Princess Emma is particularly concerned about the increased activity around the castle. Indeed, the presence of additional security personnel and government officials had been impossible to hide from their observant eldest daughter. Emma possessed an intelligence that sometimes made parenting challenging, particularly when she sensed that adults were keeping important information from her. Catherine found her children in the day nursery, a bright room overlooking the rose garden that had served as their primary playroom since Sophie's birth. Emma was reading to her younger siblings, but Catherine could see the tension in her daughter's posture, the way she kept glancing toward the windows where official cars continued to arrive and depart. Mama! Sophie launched herself into Catherine's arms with the enthusiasm of a 4-year-old who had missed her parent for what felt like ages, though it had only been a few hours. We saw you on the television in Mrs. Macpherson's sitting room, James announced importantly. You looked very serious. Were you giving one of your princess speeches? Catherine exchanged a glance with Alexander over their son's head. The time had come to explain their situation in terms that children could understand without becoming frightened or feeling responsible. Yes, darling, we were, Catherine said, settling onto the comfortable sofa with Sophie still in her arms. And now we need to talk to all of you about something very important. Emma immediately put down her book and moved closer, her intuitive understanding that this was a significant conversation. At 11, she had already begun to grasp the complexities of their public role and the responsibilities that came with their titles. Are we in trouble? She asked directly, with the kind of straightforward question that adults often avoided but children instinctively asked. No, sweetheart, we're not in trouble, Alexander said, sitting on the edge of the low table so he could maintain eye contact with all 3 children. But there are some changes happening that affect our whole family. Catherine had rehearsed this conversation in her mind dozens of times over the past week, trying to find the right balance between honesty and age-appropriate explanation. Do you remember how we sometimes travel to other countries for Papa's work? How we visited Australia and Canada, and those were wonderful trips? All 3 children nodded, their faces showing various levels of understanding and curiosity. Well, we're going to take a longer trip this time. A much longer trip. We're going to live in Canada for a while. Catherine continued gently. How long is a while? Emma asked, her sharp mind immediately focusing on the detail that mattered most. We don't know exactly, Alexander admitted. It might be a very long while. Long enough that you'll go to new schools and make new friends. James looked confused rather than upset. But what about my trains? And my room? And the stables? We'll take your trains with us, Catherine assured him. And you'll have a new room that will make just as nice as your room here. As for the stables, there are horses in Canada too. Different horses, but I think you'll like them. Sophie, still cuddled against Catherine, seemed the least concerned of the 3. Will Mrs. Macpherson come too? Yes, Mrs. Macpherson will come with us, Catherine said, grateful for at least one piece of good news to share. Emma had been processing this information with the seriousness that characterized her approach to most important matters. This isn't really a trip, is it? She said quietly. This is moving away. Forever. The word forever hung in the air like a challenge. Catherine looked into her daughter's eyes, so much like Alexander's, intelligent and perceptive, and made a decision to trust her with more truth than they had originally planned to share. We hope not forever, Catherine said carefully. But, for now, yes, we're moving away from Scotland. There are some complicated grown-up reasons that made this necessary, but I want you to know that it has nothing to do with anything you children have done. You are perfect, and we love you, and we will still be a family no matter where we live. Will people be angry at us? Emma asked, and Catherine's heart broke a little at the maturity of the question. Some people might be confused or sad, Alexander said honestly. But the people who really know us understand that sometimes families have to make difficult decisions. What matters is that we stick together and take care of each other. James had been thinking about the practical implications with the focus that 8-year-old minds brought to problems. Can we video call our friends? And will we come back for Christmas? We'll definitely video call your friends, Catherine promised. And as for Christmas, we'll have to see. But wherever we spend Christmas, we'll be together, and we'll make it special. Sophie looked up at Catherine with the trusting expression that never failed to remind her of the enormous responsibility of parenthood. Will you still be a princess in Canada? Catherine smiled, the first genuine smile she had managed all day. I'll always be your mama, which is more important than being a princess. And yes, technically I'll still be a princess, but it might be different from how it is here. Emma stood up suddenly and walked to the window that overlooked the gardens where she had learned to identify wildflowers and hunt for fairy rings. When do we have to go? Tomorrow afternoon, Alexander said quietly. The silence that followed was profound. Catherine could hear the antique clock on the mantelpiece ticking, the distant sound of a lawn mower, the normal sounds of a life that would no longer be theirs after tomorrow. I want to say goodbye to my favorite places, Emma announced with the kind of determined dignity that reminded Catherine powerfully of Alexander's grandmother, the formidable queen mother who had taught them all about grace under pressure. That's a lovely idea, Catherine said. We all should. Tonight, after dinner, we'll take a walk around the castle and the grounds, and everyone can say goodbye in their own way. James brightened at this suggestion. Can we go to the secret passage in the tower? The one that leads to the old chapel? Of course we can, Alexander said. And we'll visit the stables, and the rose garden, and anywhere else that's special to you. That evening, as the sun set over the highland landscape for the last time in their family's memory, they embarked on their farewell tour. Each child approached it differently, Emma with thoughtful solemnity, James with excited exploration as if he might discover something new at the last minute, Sophie with the adaptability of the very young who lived fully in each moment. They visited the kitchen where Cook had taught them to make shortbread, the conservatory where Catherine had painted watercolors on rainy afternoons, the library where thousands of books waited for readers who would no longer come. In the chapel, they stood together in silence, each saying private goodbyes to the ancestors whose portraits watched over them with painted eyes. Will we remember everything? Sophie asked as they stood in the entrance hall, looking up at the grand staircase they had climbed thousands of times. We'll remember the important things, Catherine assured her. And we'll have photographs and stories, and, most importantly, we'll have each other to help us remember. As they tucked the children into bed in their familiar rooms for the final time, Catherine felt the weight of all the ordinary moments that would become precious memories. The way James always forgot to brush his teeth unless reminded twice. How Sophie insisted on having her stuffed rabbit positioned just so before she could fall asleep. The serious questions Emma asked about everything from Scottish history to why adults sometimes had to make decisions that made everyone sad. Sweet dreams, Catherine whispered as she kissed each child goodnight. Tomorrow we start our next adventure together. But, as she and Alexander finally retired to their own room, Catherine allowed herself to acknowledge the fear that had been growing all day. They were leaving everything familiar and safe, venturing into an uncertain future with no guarantee of when or if they would ever be able to return home. Tomorrow would test everything they had built together as a family, everything they believed about love and loyalty, and the strength that could be found in facing the unknown together. Outside their bedroom window, Thornwick Castle settled into its final night as their home, while inside, for people who had never imagined this day would come, tried to find peace and sleep before beginning the most difficult journey of their lives. The morning of departure arrived with unseasonable sunshine, as if Scotland itself was offering one last gift of golden light across the highland landscape. Catherine woke before dawn, unable to sleep, and found herself drawn once more to the tall windows of their bedroom. The view that had greeted her for 12 years stretched out in familiar perfection, the loch reflecting the sky like a mirror, the ancient oaks that had witnessed centuries of history, the distant mountains that had seemed like guardian sentinels protecting their family's happiness. Alexander stirred behind her, and she felt his arms encircle her waist as he joined her silent vigil at the window. Neither spoke for long minutes, understanding that words would somehow diminish the profound sadness of this final morning at Thornwick Castle. The removal trucks arrived an hour ago, Alexander said eventually, his voice still rough with sleep and emotion. Mrs. Macpherson is directing the packing of our personal items. Catherine nodded, though she felt disconnected from the practical necessities of their departure. How did one pack a life? What did you take when you didn't know if you would ever return? The children's belongings had been prioritized: Emma's art supplies and favorite books, James's model train collection, Sophie's extensive assembly of stuffed animals that somehow all had names and personalities. But what about the intangible things? The sense of belonging, the weight of tradition, the knowledge that every room held memories of their growth as individuals and as a family? A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Macpherson entered with tea service, her movements carrying the same quiet efficiency that had characterized her 8 years of service, though Catherine noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she arranged the cups. "The children are awake, Your Royal Highness," the housekeeper reported. "Princess Emma has been helping to pack Princess Sophie's toys. Prince James is asking if he can say goodbye to Thunder one more time." Thunder was James's favorite horse, a gentle gelding who had carried the young prince through countless riding lessons and adventures across the estate. The thought of their son having to leave behind his beloved companion was one of many heartbreaks that Catherine had been trying not to dwell upon. "Of course he can," Catherine said immediately. "We'll all go to the stables together after breakfast. The children should have as much time as they need to say their goodbyes." Mrs. Macpherson's composure finally cracked slightly. "Ma'am, if I may say so, this is wrong. You've done nothing but good for this country, for Scotland. The people love you. This political nonsense shouldn't." "Mrs. Macpherson," Alexander said gently but firmly, "you know we can't discuss the reasons for our departure. What matters now is that we help the children through this transition as smoothly as possible." The older woman straightened her shoulders, her professional dignity reasserting itself. "Of course, Your Royal Highness. Forgive me. Breakfast will be served in the morning room whenever you're ready." After she left, Catherine sank into the chair by the fireplace, suddenly, feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of what lay ahead. "What if we're making a mistake?" she asked quietly. "What if we should be fighting this instead of simply accepting it?" Alexander knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "We've been through this, darling. Fighting would mean a prolonged public battle that would hurt the children and ultimately change nothing. The decision has been made at the highest levels. Our choice is to leave with dignity or be removed with disgrace." "But the children's future," Catherine protested. "Emma is supposed to start at St. Margaret's School in Edinburgh next year." James was finally settling in with his tutors. "Sophie has never known any home but Scotland. Are we being fair to them?" "We're protecting them," Alexander said firmly. "By making this transition on our terms, in our own time, we're giving them the best chance to adapt successfully. If we had fought and lost, they might have been forced to leave under much more difficult circumstances." Catherine knew he was right, intellectually. But her heart rebelled against the calm acceptance of injustice, against the necessity of sacrificing their children's heritage to political expediency. She thought of Emma's questions the night before, the mature sadness in her daughter's eyes as she tried to understand why their family was being forced to leave everything familiar behind. Breakfast was a subdued affair in the morning room, where French doors opened onto the terrace overlooking Catherine's beloved rose garden. She had planned and tended those roses herself, learning about soil conditions and pruning techniques from the head gardener, creating a space where the children could play safely while she worked on correspondence or prepared for public engagements. Emma picked at her porridge, her usual appetite diminished by the emotional weight of the day. "Mama," she said suddenly, "will our new house have a garden?" "I think so, sweetheart," Catherine replied, though she realized how little they actually knew about their destination. The government had provided minimal information about their new home, focusing instead on security arrangements and travel logistics. "And if it doesn't have a garden, we'll make one. Perhaps you can help me choose what to plant." James looked up from his toast with sudden interest. "Can we plant Scottish flowers? So it will be a little bit like home?" "What a wonderful idea," Catherine said, her heart lifting slightly at her son's adaptability. "We'll find heather and Scottish bluebells and maybe even some Highland wildflowers." Sophie, who had been unusually quiet throughout the meal, suddenly announced, "I want to take a piece of the castle with me." Alexander smiled at their youngest daughter's literal interpretation of their situation. "What kind of piece, princess?" "A stone," Sophie said seriously. "From the wall by the front door? So the castle can come with us." Catherine exchanged glances with Alexander. "I think that's a beautiful idea. We'll find a special stone that you can keep always." After breakfast, they made their way to the stables for what would be their final visit. The stable master, old Tom, had been with the estate for 40 years and had taught all 3 children to ride. He stood beside Thunder's stall, his weathered face carefully neutral, though Catherine could see the emotion he was trying to hide. "Young prince," he said to James in his thick Highland accent, "Thunder wanted ye to have something to remember him by." He handed James a braided rope bracelet made from horsehair, Thunder's mane. Catherine realized with a catch in her throat. James accepted the gift with the solemnity of a knight receiving his spurs, understanding instinctively that this was a moment of profound significance. "Will you take good care of Thunder for me?" James asked, his voice small but steady. "Aye, lad, that I will. And perhaps someday." Old Tom trailed off, unable to complete the promise that they might return. Emma spent long minutes with her favorite mare, Starlight, a dappled gray who had been her constant companion during their morning rides across the estate. Catherine watched her daughter whisper secrets into the horse's ear, private promises, and remembrances that belonged only to the 2 of them. Sophie was fascinated by the barn cats, insisting on saying goodbye to each one individually. The practical side of Catherine's mind noted that this was taking far longer than their schedule allowed, but the mother in her understood that these rituals of farewell were necessary for her children's emotional processing. When they finally returned to the castle, the removal trucks were nearly loaded with the possessions they had chosen to take with them. Catherine was struck by how little remained once a life was reduced to the practical essentials of clothing, books, and personal items. The furniture would stay, as would the art collection and most of the belongings that had made Thornwick Castle feel like home rather than just another royal residence. Detective Inspector Wells approached them as they stood in the entrance hall, his expression professionally neutral, but his eyes kind. Catherine had worked with him for 5 years and had come to respect his quiet competence and genuine concern for their family's welfare. "Your Royal Highnesses," he said formally, "the motorcade is ready for departure at your convenience. The flight to Canada is scheduled for 1400 hours. Catherine felt a moment of panic at the finality of those words. Once they entered those cars, there would be no turning back, no changing their minds, no hoping that this was all an elaborate nightmare from which they would eventually wake. "Mrs. McPherson?" Alexander inquired. "Already in the first car with the children's immediate needs," Wells confirmed. "She's prepared everything according to your instructions." The sound of children's voices echoed from the nursery above, where they were collecting their final possessions under Mrs. McPherson's patient supervision. Catherine could distinguish Emma's careful instructions to her siblings, James's excited chatter about the airplane journey, Sophie's questions about whether her stuffed animals would be frightened by flying. "I need a moment," Catherine said suddenly, and, without waiting for a response, she headed toward her private office. The room that had served as her headquarters for charitable work over the past 12 years felt empty despite being largely unchanged. Her desk had been cleared of active correspondence, but the photographs remained, images from hospital visits, charity galas, school openings, and community events that had defined her role as a working member of the royal family. She picked up a framed photograph from the Highland Games 3 years earlier, showing their entire family in traditional Scottish dress. Emma and James were laughing at something Alexander had whispered, while Sophie sat proudly on Catherine's lap, wearing a tiny tartan sash. They looked so happy, so settled, so completely unaware that political forces beyond their control would eventually tear them away from this life. A soft sound made her turn. Emma stood in the doorway, her expression mature beyond her 11 years. "Mama," she said quietly, "are you all right?" Catherine opened her arms, and Emma came to her immediately, allowing herself to be held despite her growing independence. "I'm sad," Catherine admitted honestly. "This is very hard for Mama and Papa too. Will it get easier?" Emma asked into Catherine's shoulder. "I think so," Catherine said, hoping she was telling the truth. "It might take time, but I believe we'll find happiness again. Different happiness, perhaps, but still real." Emma pulled back to look at her mother's face. "I want you to know that I understand. About the grown-up reasons we have to leave. I've been listening, and I've heard things. It's not fair, what's happening to us." Catherine's breath caught. She had underestimated her daughter's perception, her ability to piece together information from overheard conversations and adult tensions. "Emma, I know you and Papa can't talk about it," Emma continued with remarkable composure. "But I want you to know that James and Sophie and I trust you. If you say we have to go, then we have to go. We'll be brave." The simple dignity of her daughter's words brought tears to Catherine's eyes. "You are the most extraordinary young woman I know," she said softly. Your courage helps me be brave too. A commotion in the entrance hall below indicated that their departure could no longer be delayed. Catherine took one final look around her office, then picked up the photograph of their family at the Highland Games. Some things, she decided, were too important to leave behind. The scene in the entrance hall resembled organized chaos. Staff members stood in respectful lines to bid them farewell, many openly weeping despite their attempts to maintain professional composure. The children moved among them with natural grace, accepting hugs and well wishes with the poise they had been taught since birth. Cook, who had prepared countless family meals and birthday cakes over the years, pressed a small package into Sophie's hands. "Shortbread for the journey, little miss," she said in her thick accent. "Made with the same recipe I taught ye in the kitchen." Margaret, the governess who had helped with the children's education, embraced Emma warmly. "Continue with your art, dear one," she whispered. "You have such talent. Don't let circumstances steal that from you." Thomas, the head gardener who had been like a grandfather to all three children, knelt down to James's level. "Remember what I taught ye about planting and growing, young prince. Gardens can grow anywhere with enough love and attention." Catherine felt as though her heart was breaking with each goodbye. These people had been more than employees. They had been extended family, chosen companions who had shared in the daily life of raising the children and maintaining the traditions that connected them to centuries of history. Alexander stepped forward to address the assembled staff formally. "We want you to know," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the great hall, "that serving alongside you has been one of the greatest privileges of our lives. Your dedication, your loyalty, your friendship, these are gifts we will treasure always." Catherine added her own words, though she struggled to keep her voice steady. "You have helped us create a home filled with love and laughter. You have cared for our children as if they were your own. You have shown us what true service means. We will never forget you." The actual moment of departure felt surreal, as if Catherine was watching someone else's life unfold. The children climbed into the middle car with Mrs. Macpherson, their faces pressed to the windows as they waved goodbye to the staff gathered on the castle steps. Catherine and Alexander followed in the second car, with Detective Inspector Wells and additional security personnel bringing up the rear. As their motorcade pulled away from Thornwick Castle, Catherine turned for one last look at the building that had been their family's sanctuary. The ancient stones glowed golden in the afternoon sunlight, and she could see the Scottish flag flying proudly from the highest tower. Staff members still stood on the steps, waving until the cars disappeared around the bend in the drive. "Look back," Alexander said quietly, and Catherine realized he was speaking to both her and himself. "Remember exactly how it looks right now." The drive to the airport passed through villages where they had attended summer fetes and Christmas markets, past schools where Catherine had given talks about literacy and arts education, by community centers where Alexander had supported youth programs and veteran services. At several points, small groups of people had gathered by the roadside, some waving, others simply standing in silent tribute to their departure. Near the village of Ballater, Catherine spotted a group of children from the local primary school holding a banner they had clearly made that morning. "Thank you, Princess Catherine and Prince Alexander. We will miss you." The sight broke through her carefully maintained composure, and she found herself crying freely for the first time since this ordeal began. "The people understand," Alexander said, reaching for her hand. "That's what matters. They know this isn't our choice." At Edinburgh Airport, a private terminal had been prepared for their departure. The royal jet waited on the tarmac, gleaming white against the gray Scottish sky. Catherine had flown on this aircraft dozens of times for state visits and official engagements, but never with the knowledge that she didn't know when or if she would return to Scottish soil. The children seemed excited about the flight itself, their natural adaptability helping them focus on the adventure rather than the loss. James chattered about the airplane specifications while Sophie made sure all her stuffed animals were properly secured for takeoff. Emma remained quieter, but Catherine could see her daughter taking mental photographs, storing images and memories for future reference. As they walked across the tarmac toward the aircraft, Catherine felt the Scottish wind tugging at her coat, carrying the sense of heather and sea air that had become the background of their family's life. She breathed deeply, trying to capture and preserve everything about this moment: the sound of Highland accents from the ground crew, the sight of the mountains in the distance, the feeling of being exactly where she belonged. "Ready?" Alexander asked as they reached the aircraft steps. Catherine looked back once more at Scotland, at the country that had welcomed her as a young bride, and shaped her into the woman she had become. Then, she turned to her children, who were watching her with trust and love despite their own uncertainty about the future. "Ready," she said, and, together, their family stepped aboard the aircraft that would carry them away from everything they had ever known, toward a future that remained unwritten and unknown. As the jet engines roared to life, and they began their taxi toward the runway, Catherine pressed her face to the window for her final view of Scotland from the ground. The landscape that had been her home for 12 years grew smaller and smaller until it was just a memory, preserved in her heart along with all the love and loss this departure represented. The aircraft lifted into the Scottish sky, carrying the prince and princess and their children away from the life they had built together, toward whatever new chapter awaited them in the vast uncertainty of exile. The flight across the Atlantic passed in a strange suspension of time and emotion. Catherine found herself caught between grief for what they had left behind and anxiety about what awaited them in Canada. The children had settled into the comfortable cabin of the royal aircraft with the adaptability of youth. James studying aviation charts with one of the crew members, Sophie napping peacefully with her favorite stuffed elephant, Emma reading quietly, but occasionally gazing out at the clouds below with thoughtful eyes. Alexander spent most of the flight in communication with various officials, handling the logistics of their relocation and the transfer of his remaining official duties. Catherine watched him work and marveled at his ability to maintain focus on practical matters when her own mind felt scattered across an ocean, half of her consciousness still standing in the entrance hall of Thornwick Castle, saying goodbye to people who had become family. Mrs. Macpherson moved efficiently through the cabin, ensuring the children were comfortable and keeping herself occupied with small tasks that probably didn't need doing. Catherine recognized the housekeeper's coping mechanism. When faced with circumstances beyond one's control, focus on the manageable details. It was a wisdom born of years in service, and Catherine found herself grateful beyond words for the older woman's steadying presence. "Mama," Sophie said, climbing into Catherine's lap with the casual affection of a 4-year-old. "How long until we get to Canada?" "A few more hours, darling," Catherine replied, smoothing her daughter's hair. "Are you excited about seeing our new house?" Sophie considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important questions. "Will it have stairs?" "I like stairs because they make interesting sounds when you walk on them." Catherine smiled despite her melancholy. "I think most houses have stairs, sweetheart. And I'm sure our new house will have interesting sounds of its own." Emma looked up from her book, a collection of Scottish folk tales that Catherine had packed specially for the journey. "Will there be other children nearby?" she asked. "In Scotland, we knew everyone in the village. Will Canada be like that?" The question highlighted one of Catherine's deepest concerns about their relocation. At Thornwick Castle, the children had grown up embedded in a community that knew them not just as royal offspring but as individuals. Emma with her artistic talents and thoughtful questions, James with his mechanical curiosity and easy friendships, Sophie with her fearless exploration of gardens and stables. Building those kinds of connections in a foreign country would take time, perhaps years. "I hope there will be children nearby," Catherine said honestly. "But it might be different from Scotland at first. We'll need to be patient while we all adjust to our new home." Alexander finished his phone call and joined their conversation, settling into the seat across from Catherine with a slight smile. "I have some news about our new house," he said. "Lord Pemberton has sent me photographs and a more detailed description." He pulled out his tablet and showed them images of a substantial Victorian-style home situated on several acres of wooded land outside Vancouver. The house was impressive but not ostentatious, with bay windows, wraparound porches, and gardens that showed signs of careful planning and maintenance. "It looks like it has good places to hide," James observed with interest, studying the photos with the eye of someone who had spent years exploring the secret passages and hidden corners of an ancient castle. "And there's a big garden," Emma noted, pointing to images of flower beds and mature trees. "Maybe we can plant those Scottish flowers we talked about." Catherine felt a small flutter of hope as she examined the photographs. The house looked welcoming rather than institutional, a place where children could run and play and gradually begin to feel at home. It wasn't Thornwick Castle, but it had possibilities. "There's something else," Alexander continued, his expression brightening slightly. "The Canadian government has arranged for us to visit several local charities and community organizations once we're settled. They're hoping we might consider taking on some patronages if we're interested." Catherine's spirits lifted genuinely for the first time since they had left Scotland. The prospect of meaningful work, of being able to use their position to help others, made their exile feel less like banishment and more like a new opportunity for service. What kinds of organizations? She asked with growing interest. Children's hospitals, veterans services, environmental conservation groups, programs for immigrant families, Alexander listed. They seem to understand that we'll want to continue our charitable work. Mrs. McPherson, who had been listening while organizing the children's travel bags, spoke up quietly. If I may say so, Your Royal Highness, that sounds very much like the work you were doing in Scotland. Catherine nodded, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. Perhaps they wouldn't have to abandon everything that had given their lives meaning. Perhaps there were ways to serve and contribute that didn't depend entirely on geography or politics. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, announcing their descent into Vancouver. Catherine gathered Sophie closer and watched through the window as the Canadian landscape came into view, mountains and forests and gleaming water that reminded her surprisingly of Scotland, though the scale was grander and the urban sprawl more extensive. It's beautiful, Emma said softly, pressing her face to her own window. Look at all the trees, and the mountains are huge. James was fascinated by the engineering of the approach to Vancouver International Airport, pointing out features of the runway construction and the harbor bridges to anyone who would listen. His enthusiasm was infectious, and Catherine found herself smiling at his ability to find wonder in new experiences. The landing was smooth, and as they taxied toward a private terminal, Catherine could see a small group of officials waiting to welcome them. The Canadian government had promised a low-key arrival, avoiding the media attention that would have made their first moments in their new country feel like a public spectacle. The June afternoon in Vancouver was warm and bright, with a quality of light that felt different from Scotland, cleaner somehow, and more intense. Catherine breathed deeply as they descended from the aircraft, catching scents of pine and ocean that were familiar yet distinct from the Highland air they had left behind. A distinguished woman in her 50s approached them with a warm smile. Your Royal Highnesses, welcome to Canada. I'm Janet Morrison, Deputy Minister for Protocol. We're honored to have you here. Alexander stepped forward to handle the formal introductions while Catherine gathered their children, noting how Emma stood slightly closer to her than usual, a sign of nervousness despite her composed demeanor. James bounced slightly on his toes, excited by the newness of everything around them, while Sophie clung to her stuffed elephant and observed their surroundings with wide eyes. The drive to your residence will take approximately 45 minutes, Ms. Morrison explained as they were guided toward a waiting motorcade. We've arranged for a security detail, but we've tried to keep it as unobtrusive as possible. The Canadian people respect privacy, and we want your family to feel as normal as possible. The word normal struck Catherine as both hopeful and slightly ironic. Nothing about their situation was normal. Exiled royalty adapting to life in a foreign country, children learning to navigate new schools and social situations without the familiar framework of their heritage, a family trying to rebuild their sense of purpose and belonging from scratch. The motorcade moved through Vancouver's suburbs, past tree-lined streets and well-maintained neighborhoods that spoke of prosperity and civic pride. Catherine found herself comparing everything to Scotland. The architecture was more varied, the gardens more colorful, the scale of everything larger, and somehow more optimistic. Look at that playground, James said excitedly, pointing to a community park with elaborate climbing structures and what appeared to be a splash pad. It's enormous. And there's a library, Emma noted, spotting the distinctive design of a public building. I wonder if they have good books. Sophie had fallen asleep against Catherine's shoulder, overwhelmed by the journey and the constant stream of new impressions. Catherine envied her youngest daughter's ability to find peace in sleep, to trust that the adults around her would handle whatever needed handling. Their new home appeared around a bend in a tree-lined road, exactly as it had looked in the photographs, but somehow more welcoming in person. The Victorian architecture felt substantial and comforting, while the gardens showed evidence of recent care and attention. Someone had hung flower baskets from the porch eaves, and Catherine could see what looked like a vegetable patch behind a white picket fence. It's lovely, she said to Alexander, and meant it. The house had character and warmth, qualities that couldn't be photographed but were immediately apparent in person. The Canadian security team had clearly been briefed on the importance of maintaining a residential rather than institutional atmosphere. Their presence was professional but unobtrusive, and Catherine appreciated that they were dressed in civilian clothes rather than the formal uniforms that might have made the children feel more displaced. Mrs. McPherson emerged from a support vehicle with her characteristic efficiency, immediately beginning to direct the unloading of their luggage and personal items. "The house has been prepared according to your preferences," she reported to Catherine. "The children's rooms are ready, and I've arranged the nursery items as similarly as possible to their rooms at Thornwick." The thoughtfulness of this touched Catherine deeply. Mrs. McPherson understood that familiar arrangements could provide emotional anchoring for children facing major transitions. Small details like the placement of favorite books or the angle of a beloved lamp could make the difference between a strange new space and the beginning of home. Emma was the first to explore, moving through the main floor with the careful attention she gave to new environments. "Mama," she called from what appeared to be a sunroom. "There are art supplies here. Paints and canvases and everything." Catherine followed her daughter's voice and found a bright, well-lit space that had been set up as a studio, complete with easels and a full range of artistic materials. Someone had clearly researched Emma's interests and made an effort to provide continuity with her creative pursuits. "This is wonderful, sweetheart," Catherine said, genuinely moved by the gesture. "You'll be able to continue your painting right away." James had discovered what appeared to be a workshop in the basement, complete with tools and space for his model train collection. His delighted shouts echoed up through the house, and Catherine could hear him explaining to Mrs. McPherson about the proper way to set up his track layout. Sophie, now awake and curious, was fascinated by the bay windows in what would become their main living space. "Mama, look how the light makes patterns on the floor," she said with wonder. "It's like the conservatory at home, but different." The word home hung in the air with complex meaning. Catherine felt the familiar tightness in her chest at the reminder of what they had left behind. But she also recognized the possibility inherent in Sophie's easy acceptance of this new space. Alexander was deep in conversation with Ms. Morrison and the head of their security detail, discussing practical matters like school enrollment for the children, medical care arrangements, and the protocols for any future public appearances. Catherine appreciated his focus on these necessities, even as her own attention was drawn to the emotional landscape of their transition. "Your Royal Highness," Ms. Morrison said, approaching Catherine with a folder of documents. "I have information about the local schools and community resources. The children are welcome to start classes as soon as you feel they're ready, or they can take additional time to adjust if you prefer." Catherine accepted the folder gratefully, though the thought of her children entering Canadian schools filled her with both hope and apprehension. Emma, in particular, would face the challenge of making new friends while navigating questions about her unusual background and their reasons for leaving Scotland. "There's also this," Ms. Morrison continued, handing Catherine a leather-bound book. "It's a collection of messages from Canadian families who have followed your charitable work over the years. They wanted you to know that you're welcome here, that they understand something of what you've sacrificed." Catherine opened the book to find pages of handwritten notes, emails, and letters from ordinary Canadians expressing support and encouragement. A mother from Toronto wrote about how Catherine's advocacy for children's mental health had helped her find resources for her autistic son. A veteran from Calgary thanked Alexander for his support of military families and promised that Canadian veterans would welcome him to their community. "The children who have participated in your various youth programs have been especially vocal," Ms. Morrison added with a smile. "There's a group of young artists in Montreal who have created a mural in your honor. They're hoping you might visit them once you're settled." The unexpected kindness of these gestures brought tears to Catherine's eyes. She had been so focused on what they were losing that she hadn't fully considered what they might be gaining. New communities to serve, fresh opportunities to make a difference, different perspectives on the work that had always given their lives meaning. That evening, as they gathered for their first dinner in their Canadian home, Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced in months: cautious optimism. The children were already beginning to adapt, exploring their new rooms, and making plans for arranging their belongings. Mrs. McPherson had managed to create familiar routines despite the completely changed environment. Alexander seemed more relaxed than he had been since the crisis began, perhaps relieved to be away from the political pressures that had made their final months in Scotland so difficult. "What do you think?" Alexander asked as they sat together in the sunroom after the children had gone to bed, watching the last light fade over the Canadian mountains. Catherine considered his question carefully. "I think," she said slowly, "that this might not be the end of our story. It might be a new chapter." Through the windows, They could see lights beginning to twinkle in the houses scattered across their new neighborhood. Somewhere behind those lights were families living their own stories, facing their own challenges, building their own versions of happiness and meaning. Tomorrow, Catherine and Alexander and their children would begin the work of joining that community, of finding their place in a new country that had opened its doors to them in their hour of need. The road ahead remained uncertain, filled with challenges they couldn't yet anticipate. But, for the first time since leaving Scotland, Catherine felt something that resembled hope, the possibility that home might be something they could create together, wherever they were, rather than something they could only inherit or lose. 6 months after their arrival in Canada, Catherine stood in the garden of their Vancouver home, watching Emma teach a group of local children how to paint autumn landscapes. The maple trees surrounding their property had transformed into a spectacular display of red and gold that rivaled anything Scotland had ever offered, and Emma had discovered a talent for capturing the intensity of Canadian light that was entirely her own. The art classes had begun almost by accident. Emma had been struggling with the transition to her new school, finding it difficult to connect with classmates who knew nothing of Highland traditions or royal protocols. Catherine had suggested that she might teach some neighborhood children to paint as a way of sharing her own talents while building friendships on her own terms. Now, every Saturday morning, their garden filled with young artists aged 8 to 14, all eager to learn from the princess who had traded her castle for a Victorian house but had never lost her passion for creative expression. Emma moved among them with growing confidence, offering gentle corrections and enthusiastic praise with a maturity that continued to astound Catherine. "Remember what Mama taught me," Emma said to a frustrated 10-year-old named Sarah. "Painting isn't about making everything perfect. It's about capturing how something makes you feel." Catherine smiled as she recognized her own words in her daughter's teaching. The months of adjustment had been challenging for all of them, but watching Emma find her voice as both student and teacher had been one of the unexpected joys of their new life. James came racing around the corner of the house, followed by his new best friend Michael and 3 other boys from their local school. At 9 years old, James had adapted to Canadian life with remarkable ease, his natural gregariousness helping him forge friendships that transcended cultural differences. His latest obsession was ice hockey, a sport he had never encountered in Scotland but had embraced with characteristic enthusiasm. "Mama, can we have hot chocolate after practice?" he called out, barely pausing in his trajectory toward the back garden where Alexander had helped him set up a practice rink using synthetic ice panels. "Of course," Catherine replied, though she wasn't sure he had heard her response. The sound of hockey sticks and laughter filled the air as the boys began their informal game, supervised by Alexander, who had surprised everyone by developing a genuine appreciation for Canadian winter sports. Sophie emerged from the house carrying a basket of vegetables from their kitchen garden, trailed by Mrs. McPherson, who had become something of a local legend for her ability to grow Scottish root vegetables in Canadian soil. At 5 years old now, Sophie had adapted to their new life with the resilience of the very young, though she still occasionally asked when they were going to visit the old house again. "Look, Mama," Sophie said proudly, displaying carrots and turnips that would have made any Highland gardener proud. "Mrs. McPherson says these are big enough for tonight's soup." "They're perfect, darling," Catherine said, admiring their small harvest. The kitchen garden had been one of their first successful adaptations to Canadian life, providing both practical sustenance and emotional connection to the self-sufficiency they had valued at Thornwick Castle. Mrs. McPherson approached with the satisfied expression she wore when domestic matters were proceeding according to her exacting standards. "The dinner preparations are well underway, Your Royal Highness," she reported. "The local families should begin arriving around 6 o'clock. Tonight marked a significant milestone in their Canadian journey, their first attempt at hosting a community gathering similar to the informal events they had regularly held in Scotland." Catherine had been nervous about the evening for weeks, uncertain whether their neighbors would feel comfortable in the company of exiled royalty, whether the cultural differences would prove too substantial to bridge. Her concerns had proven largely unfounded. The Canadian families they had met over the past months had approached them with a combination of respect and natural warmth that had made integration surprisingly smooth. Dr. Patricia Wong, whose daughter attended Emma's art classes, had become something of a confidant for Catherine, offering practical advice about everything from school enrollment to winter clothing. Tom and Susan Crawford, whose son Michael had become James's closest friend, had helped Alexander understand the intricacies of youth hockey leagues and community sports culture. "Are you nervous about tonight?" Alexander asked, appearing beside her with the quiet footstep she had learned to recognize over their years of marriage. A little, Catherine admitted. It feels important somehow. Like we're trying to prove that we belong here, that we can build the same kind of connections we had in Scotland. Alexander's hand found hers, his wedding ring catching the afternoon sunlight. We don't have to prove anything, he said gently. We just have to be ourselves. That was always enough before. Catherine squeezed his hand gratefully. Alexander had weathered their transition with characteristic steadiness, finding ways to maintain his sense of purpose even without the official duties that had previously defined his days. His work with Canadian veterans organizations had grown from tentative involvement to passionate advocacy, and his understanding of military mental health issues had proven valuable in a country with its own complex relationship with peacekeeping and service. The afternoon passed quickly as they prepared for their guests. Emma finished her art class and helped Catherine arrange flowers from their garden in simple arrangements that would grace the dining table. James and his friends concluded their hockey practice and trooped through the house in search of snacks, their cheeks flushed with cold and excitement. Sophie appointed herself official taste tester for Mrs. McPherson's cooking, a responsibility she took with appropriate seriousness. As evening approached, Catherine found herself standing once again at